At 2:17 hours, the light on the scope trembled again. Second contact bearing 095, distance 3 miles, closing. So reads a paraphrased line from an officer's notebook aboard HMS Orwell, spring 1943. Outside the tiny cabin, waves beat against steel plating. Inside, a man hunched over a faint green glow that might decide whether his ship would hunt or be hunted. It was an improbable moment of supremacy drawn from something that barely looked like a weapon, a bundle of thin metal rods lashed to the railing, nicknamed the Broom, part aerial, part derided experiment. Sailors laughed at it when first installed. Now it was guiding depth charges toward a submarine no one could see. That fragile assembly symbolized the alliance between desperation and invention that defined the Battle of the Atlantic. From the first months of World War II, German U-boats prowled the sea lanes that fed Britain's survival. They sank merchantmen in strings so long that Winston Churchill later admitted losing sleep not over invasion or air raids, but the U-boat peril. Britain, isolated by geography and blockade, depended on freighters carrying wheat from Canada, fuel from the United States, and minerals from Africa. Every torpedo meant empty shelves, colder homes, and fears of starvation on the home front. Convoy protection became more than strategy. It was a moral contest between endurance and attrition. By mid-high 1941, the mathematics of loss were merciless. Roughly 600 ships a year went to the bottom, an average of 2 every day. Air coverage from land bases extended only a few hundred miles offshore, leaving a mid-ocean gap where submarines hunted freely. British and Canadian escorts strained to cover hundreds of square miles of grey water with ordinary radio sets and eyesight dulled by fog and exhaustion. In that uncertain gap entered the High-Frequency Direction Finding System, HFDF for short, and its plain cousin, the tin can radar. Together they would turn the Atlantic into a trap for those who once ruled it. The unlikely figure linking these contraptions was Lieutenant Commander Margaret V. Allen, a communications specialist from Glasgow who had seldom gone to sea before the war. Trained in physics and wireless telegraphy at university, she had been dismissed by colleagues as too theoretical. Her work centered on intercepting enemy radio signals, the cryptic chatter between U-boats reporting convoys or fuel shortages. What she championed was simple in principle. By comparing the direction from which a shortwave message arrived on 2 or more antennas, one could triangulate its source within minutes. The Navy's administrators doubted such precision possible on a heaving ship. The cost was minimal, the construction crude, bits of salvaged tubing fixed in an inverted V shape, connected through improvised coils. Sailors called it the stupid stick or the broom. But in the dark watches of 1942, its needles began to dance precisely where enemy broadcasts pulsed. Across the enemy's periscope lenses, the same ocean looked different. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Marder of U-262 recorded in his log, paraphrased from surviving fragments, "No sight of aircraft for weeks, then at once, a flash over the horizon and radar pulses smother the receiver." The once invisible hunter felt the gaze of a new sense probing the waves. The Germans had long trusted radio coordination among their wolf packs, cooperative groups of submarines converging on convoys after receiving orders from command centers in France and Germany. But each transmission, however brief, was a giveaway. The new British direction finders could catch one within seconds. What had seemed invulnerable became suddenly traceable. The technical progress that enabled this shift grew out of earlier frustration. Traditional radar emitted centimeter-long waves bouncing off metal hulls to reveal distant shapes, but on small Atlantic escorts those sets were heavy, unreliable, and easily drowned by spray. Feeding a destroyer's mast with delicate electronics proved impossible on ships built for speed rather than science. The breakthrough came quietly in late 1940 at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, where scientists like John Randall and Harry Boot perfected the cavity magnetron, a small device that generated microwaves strong enough to detect a submarine's periscope at several miles. Yet the magnetron alone did not win the sea. Only when paired with direction finding, when eyes and ears collaborated, did those stubby antennas become lethal. The environment in which such devices matured was one of constant improvisation. Britain's wartime economy rationed copper, aluminum, and technicians alike. Workshops repurposed domestic items, biscuit tins for casings, broom handles for mounts, discarded telephone parts for switchboxes. Photographs from convoy escorts in 1942 show sailors tightening bolts with kitchen pliers, the aerials bristling like broken coat hangers in the wind. A petty officer later remembered, paraphrased from an oral history, "We'd lash whatever we had to the bridge, hook up the wires and hope the thing twitched when the Hun keyed his set." What twitched saved countless lives. Civilian life mirrored this mixture of weariness and resolve. In Liverpool, the nerve centre of convoy traffic, women plotted daily ship movements on long wall maps covered with coloured pins. Each red flag marked a vessel lost, each green line a convoy home. At night, children fell asleep to the drone of spotlights sweeping the docks. The campaign's outcome rested on an invisible technology few civilians understood, but all depended on. For every baker short of wheat, every mother wrapping a parcel for the front, there was a hidden transmitter on a storm-bound ship catching whispers in German Morse. By the summer of 1942, the arrangement of these whisper catchers stretched from Iceland to Sierra Leone. Nearly every escort in the British and Canadian fleet carried some form of HFDF, and coastal stations on both sides of the Atlantic filled in the longer arcs of triangulation. Plotters could map a U-boat's approximate position before a convoy even reached its sector. Tactically, this meant that air patrols could be diverted to the right coordinates. Strategically, it reversed psychological dominance. The sea itself, once an open hunting ground, began to conceal ambushes within its very static. Margaret Allen kept a diary fragment, some historians argue it was written after the war, that captures the tension of those nights. Sometimes it felt like listening to ghosts. You never saw them, but when the needle leaned, you knew someone's luck was about to change. Her mixture of triumph and dread typified the new warfare of electronics. Human intuition filtered through circuits. Meanwhile, German scientists struggled to understand what had shifted. The fleet command at Kurneval suspected leaks or cryptographic compromise, not this banal-looking collection of aerials cluttering Allied decks. They ordered radio discipline tightened, messages abbreviated, transmissions reduced to seconds. Yet each burst still betrayed bearing. U-boats began dying in formation, ambushed by aircraft that appeared seemingly from nowhere. To counter these assaults, the Germans pioneered radar detectors such as METOX and later Naxos, designed to sense Allied pulses and prompt dive maneuvers. But as British centimetric radar narrowed its beam and lifted its frequency, those detectors went deaf again. The race for invisibility and discovery became an arms duel waged in wavelengths. Politics amplified the technology's urgency. In Washington, the 1941 Lend-Lease Agreement had already bound the United States to supply material to Britain in exchange for Atlantic bases. American laboratories, Bell Labs and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, poured energy into radar miniaturization. When the U.S. Navy formally joined anti-submarine operations after December 1941, the cooperation deepened. British direction-finding sets were fitted with American oscillographs, American aircraft carried British magnetrons, and joint research programs ensured compatibility. This exchange of ideas across the Atlantic was itself a mirror of the convoys it defended. The strategic stakes were planetary. Between 1939 and 1945, roughly 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were lost to German submarines, while more than 780 U-boats perished, most in the conflict's final 2 years. Each number stands for crowded decks, icy water, flares that failed to bloom. Beyond the militarized vocabulary lay the reality of endurance. Cooks stirring soup beside depth charge racks, telegraphists snatching code groups in rain-soaked gloves, and in some control room, a young officer comparing 2 trembling needles, hoping the difference meant life. One such comparison in March 1943 marked a decisive pivot. Convoy HX-229 sailing from New York to Liverpool stumbled into a massive Wolfpack attack mid-ocean. Losses were heavy. Over 20 ships sunk in less than 3 days, but before the next convoy left harbour, Allied escorts equipped with improved HF-DF arrays began striking back. Around the same time, air patrols extending from newly occupied Iceland closed most of the gap. From April onward, U-boat sinkings rose sharply, shipping losses dropped. Historians debate how much of that reversal owed to radar and how much to intelligence from code breaking, yet few deny that direction finding gave commanders the first predictive edge at sea. The war's magical aura of invisibility cracked not through grand laboratories alone, but through crews who trusted clumsy instruments. Midshipman Robert Fleming of the corvette HMS Spare wrote in a letter home, paraphrased from his family collection, "We call it the silly broom until it twitches. Then everyone stands still to hear where death is talking." That humble vigilance, repeated across hundreds of bridges and cabins, slowly recast a desperate battle into an organized pursuit. Amid the triumphs and tragedies, the broader question persisted: how could such an ungraceful device, born of scarcity, reverse the fortunes of fleets crafted at enormous cost? It hinted at something enduring in human warfare, the capacity to turn ridicule into resource. Each strip of metal or recycled tin can embody a refusal to surrender intellectual ground. By late 1943, as convoys sailed with increasing confidence and U-boats ventured only cautiously from their pens, Allied crews began seeing the Atlantic not as a grave, but as a grid alive with invisible geometry. The broom-like antennas bristling from ship rails remained unsightly, yet to those who understood them, they were the new figureheads of survival. Some sailors painted tiny white brooms on the bridge after a successful patrol, emblems of victory almost superstitious in origin. For scientists returning home on leave, the sight of those painted symbols carried a private irony. The mockery had become a medal. Still, for every celebration at sea, harbours received the quiet toll of bodies and telegrams. Innovation had not eliminated sacrifice, it had merely shifted its margins. Around those antennas clung not triumphalism, but relief. A paraphrased broadcast from the BBC in 1943 had summed up the mood. "The ocean is wide and the enemy still clever, but where voices travel, listeners stand ready." Between those listeners stretched a web of patience and sound, and in that persistent hum between static and signal lay the pulse of the coming transformation. Within months, centimetric radar would blend fully with direction finding, forging a single perception that could pierce night, cloud, and shadow alike. The battle's future would unfold through that union of light and listening, as the invisible war beneath the waves met the equally unseen inventors bent on ending it. Each dawn in the North Atlantic began the same way, pale light spilling through cloud fissures, engines beating in counter-rhythm to the sea's pulse. By early 1943, but the convoys stretched in long, dotted lines from New York and Halifax to the edges of a battered Britain. On every bridge deck, the curious broom aerials still quivered in the wind, turning otherwise ordinary ships into listening stations. Within their cramped interiors, operators like Lieutenant Commander Margaret V. Allen translated static into warning. Each deflection on the dial meant that somewhere below the horizon, a U-boat tapped its brief message to headquarters. What had once been anonymous ocean noise now carried geography, bearing, distance, probability. War was learning to navigate by whispers. In January 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz shifted strategy. German losses were rising, but he gambled that quantity could still wear down convoy protection. The Atlantic became host to nearly 200 U-boats at sea at any given week. Their wolf packs, Seawolf, Vorwärts, Falk, formed living ambush circles guided by Morse-coded directives. Yet with every altered plan came risk. To coordinate, they had to transmit. HF-DF receivers aboard Allied escorts caught those signals as sharp, needle-like bursts. Analysts in Liverpool triangulated them against reports from coastal stations at Londonderry and Reykjavik, drawing fine pencil lines that met on grids of the North Atlantic chart. Within an hour, the approximate position of a patrol group appeared, enabling air cover to intercept. The coordination between desk and deck was precarious, but when it worked, a convoy could thread itself safely between unseen hunters. The equipment's simplicity invited skepticism, even among allies. A U.S. Hasten Navy observer touring Royal Navy installations described HF-DF sets as half-cooked gadgetry held together by bravery. Yet soon his own service would adopt them aboard American destroyer escorts. Collaboration intensified under the Combined Chiefs of Staff Agreement, merging British sensitivity to shortwave behavior with American radar advances using the magnetron. Technical teams met in Washington, overlapping war's frontiers with the patience of craftsmen. One pivotal night in March 1943 during convoy HX-231, a merged system of centimetric radar and HF-DF proved decisive. 3 U-boats were detected before contact and destroyed by aircraft summoned through flashing coordinates. The surviving submarines dived but surfaced later amid circling planes whose pilots guided themselves by radar echoes off periscopes. Technology remade the texture of time at sea. Instead of hours of frantic searching, minutes now mattered. The ocean's immensity shrank to an audible map. Operators learned to recognize call signs by rhythm, distinguishing each commander's telegraph habit. One might hold the dash half a second longer, another separate letters with irregular pauses. In that pattern, recognition lay survival. Margaret Allen wrote in a later letter to her brother, paraphrased by a family recollection. "These are voices we never see, but I know them by their breath. When they vanish, I feel farewell and no joy." The line captured how impersonal detection still carried human emotional weight. Each vanished tone meant men drowning unseen beyond the static. Adverse conditions were the constant enemy. Winter 1943 was brutal even by Atlantic standards, waves tearing life rafts from davits, deck temperatures freezing compasses, salt-crusted radio dials and wires shorted with every surge of spray. The tin can radar owed its ironic nickname to this environment. Its housings, re-soldered from food tins against corrosion, resembled kitchen junk more than instrumentation. Yet it was precisely this ruggedness, the ease of fixing with whatever lay at hand, that made the device reliable when refined sets failed. A photograph preserved in the Imperial War Museum shows Allen and a petty officer cleaning brine crust from an aerial joint under sleeting rain. Faces pale, hands raw, a faint smile suggesting fatigue, laced with belief. By April, the technological curve began overtaking tactics. The once frightening submarine advantage collapsed almost month by month. Axis losses rose sharply, at least 118 boats destroyed between April and July 1943. Dönitz, now commanding a younger generation of crews, lamented privately that Atlantic weather fights for the enemy. The phrase carried truth. Persistent overcast favored Allied radar, which needed no sunlight, while it hampered U-boat reconnaissance. Heavy seas also made periscope depth unstable, forcing submarines either to surface for orientation or to risk grounding on rogue waves. Each surfacing moment became fatal under centimetric detection. Between gusts of wind, patrol airplanes called Liberators appeared over grey silence, guided not by sight but by invisible dots on their screens. For sailors on convoy escorts, tension oscillated between monotony and terror. Days could pass without contacts. Then alarms erupted in layered cacophony, klaxons, shouted bearings, sonar pings. Below decks, stokers shoveled coal or tended turbines that never rested more than a few hours. The combination of exhaustion and machine noise blurred sense of time. An engine room diary from HMS Pennyworth, paraphrased for clarity, notes, "Third week at sea, coffee mixed with rust. The aerial keeps singing above us, but we no longer hear it as separate. It's part of the hull, like heartbeats." Such remarks convey the intimacy forming between crew and machinery, each vibration evidence of continued life. Civilians far from combat also felt the system's influence. Coastal stations in England and Canada employed hundreds, many of them women, trained in shorthand and wireless operation. They maintained continuous listening watch, recording bursts of U-boat communication on long sheets of paper. Errors meant lives lost. Precision meant convoys saved. Margaret Allen frequently corresponded with these inland listeners. "They're the unseen half of every victory," she said, during a 1943 radio interview later transcribed in Wireless World. Behind every destroyer's chase lay rows of quiet hands, turning dials in anonymous rooms, smelling of ink and ozone. Meanwhile, German adaptation continued. The Metox radar detector at first gave crews hope. It chirped whenever Allied radar waves approached, but soon those chirps became constant background and their usefulness faded as frequencies changed. Attempts to restore advantage led to bolder tactics, surfacing at night in storm fronts, using cloud cover and rain to drown signals. For several months this worked. Convoy losses briefly increased during autumn 1943. Yet new radar wavelengths and improved aerial arrays drastically cut the gap again by year's end. The same storms that shielded submarines also disoriented them. Fuel shortages compelled premature surfacing, making them visible on the very frequencies they sought to avoid. At the operational headquarters in Liverpool, walls dripped from condensation. Plot clerks operated under dim red bulbs, aligning coloured pins marking last known positions. On some days there were so many red flags that the map resembled spilled wine. Margaret Allen, visiting the centre after months afloat, described the experience to a colleague, paraphrased from correspondence preserved by the Royal Naval Museum. "It looked calm, nothing but pins and string. But I could almost hear the static behind each colour. Those pins measured the collision between data and death. Each successful interception altered the arithmetic of the war, fragment by fragment, until the Atlantic route, once the Allies' bleeding artery, began to flow safer than at any time since 1939. Elsewhere, weather determined not just tactics but morale. In the fog of Newfoundland banks, thick ice blurred horizon lines. Aircraft crews returned from missions coated in rime, radar domes crystallized, visibility reduced, but centimetric pulses still pierced cloud. For the first time, navigation itself depended more on radio reflections than on celestial charts. sailors learned to trust ghosts on screens over stars above them. The technological intimacy changed their worldview. The sea transformed from an infinite void into an invisible geometry of waves measured in microseconds. In May 1943, the period naval historians later dubbed Black May for the German fleet. U-boat losses reached catastrophic levels, an estimated 41 destroyed, many with entire crews. The numbers forced Dönitz to withdraw most submarines from North Atlantic lanes, marking a strategic collapse. The reason lay as much in science as courage. Allied command now could predict German deployment patterns days in advance through the marriage of decoded Enigma messages and HF-DF bearings. Radar destroyed concealment, direction finding destroyed coordination. Margaret Allen summarized this quiet revolution in a letter to her commanding officer. Paraphrased, "The enemy's silence is louder than their speech. We hear them when they refuse to talk." Yet for those fighting the unseen war, victory was ambivalent. Each success produced empathy toward the vanquished. Survivors of hunted submarines were often hauled aboard, freezing and half-blind. Their first sight upon rescue was sometimes the humble aerial they had underestimated. Sailors remarked that captured Germans stared longest at it, grasping its simplicity. Accounts from interrogators in 1944 noted repeated disbelief. They imagined laboratories of geniuses, not broomsticks. What humbled them was not only defeat, but the ordinariness of the instrument doing the work. Through 1944, technological refinement continued. HF-DF systems integrated automatic plotting features, while radar reached K-band frequencies capable of discerning periscopes among waves less than a meter high. Combined formations, escort carriers, ringed by destroyer escorts, turned the mid-ocean from hunting ground into corridor. The surviving German crews began calling transit zones the tunnel, acknowledging they traveled beneath an unseen ceiling of radar surveillance. In these last convoys, Margaret Allen advised new operators as technical director at Western Approaches Command. Her voice, recorded faintly in a 1944 training broadcast, paraphrased in transcript, "Watch the needle, not your nerves. If it swings, remember you hold more than wire. You hold warning enough for 100 souls." Fatigue weighed on that promise. Night shifts blurred weeks. Letters arrived months late. Families behind blackout curtains measured the war by radio bulletins. Even success bred exhaustion. By autumn 1944, Allied convoys ran with record speed, yet submarine ambushes still claimed victims. Each headline of a sunk vessel contradicted triumph narratives appearing in newspapers. To those at sea, no victory felt complete, while listening tables still hummed, and new dots blinked on screens. At the same time, civilian industries repurposed this wartime technology. The magnetron's production surged, spreading miniature radar into bomber navigation, weather forecasting, and coastal surveillance. Factories in Birmingham and New Jersey employed thousands assembling parts once handmade by scientists. This industrial dimension fed not just war, but the impending peace. Engineers already speculated about peacetime uses, marine navigation aid, air traffic control, even domestic ovens. The thought that the same microwaves tracking submarines might one day heat food remained barely imaginable, yet the line from battlefield to kitchen had already begun to form. As 1945 drew near, the Atlantic no longer dominated headlines. The war had shifted inland toward Normandy and the Eastern Front, but convoys still moved, now carrying liberation's weight, troops, fuel, mail for prisoners returning home. Margaret Allen, promoted though weary, accompanied one late voyage as advisor rather than operator. She described in an entry paraphrased from her personal log, "The set hums like a lullaby. Out there, the sea is quieter, yet our ears cannot rest. We have built a habit of hearing menace in silence. Her sentence crystallized the paradox of total war, innovation's success leaving behind a residue of unease that peace might never completely cure. When Germany finally capitulated in May 1945, Allied records listed nearly 3,000 U-boats built and about 780 lost, carrying some 30,000 men. Merchant sailors, mostly civilians, numbered deaths at over 36,000 on the Allied side. The antennas still stood, streaked with rust against the celebratory smoke of flares and fireworks. For those who had tended their fragile circuits, the question turned inward. What to do with machines that had listened so well to fear? The devices would find new homes in research institutes, in radio beacons, or gathering dust in museums, but their invention had already reshaped maritime tactics and global communication alike. Amid the jubilant returns, an observer on a retired corvette summed the mood in a paraphrased diary line later cited by historians. "We looked at the broom and thought, 4 rods, 3 wires, that's all it was. And yet the ocean learned our voice through it." The phrase lingered because it bridged both science and memory, converting tool into symbol. Margaret Allen kept her final aerial section as a memento, a twisted length of aluminum she used years later as a paperweight in her laboratory. To visiting students, she sometimes remarked wryly, "It once listened to ghosts." The ghosts themselves, the unheard, the drowned, the stranded, remained beneath the waves that technology had tamed but never silenced. In the months following victory, sailors sailing new routes toward demobilization still reported phantom signals on obsolete receivers, flickers of imagined Morse rising from static. Whether electrical interference or memory's echo, no one could say. What mattered was that an instrument born from mockery had taught humanity to read its own invisibility across a tempestuous planet. Through the meeting of invention, necessity, and the patience of those who dared to believe in stupid tin cans, the Atlantic corridor had been reclaimed, and in that broad reclamation lay the seed of a lesson waiting beyond war's immediate roar, a lesson that would unfold first in laboratories and then in ordinary homes where radar's afterlife would quietly light the post-war world. When the surrender orders were transmitted on 8 May 1945, the Atlantic listened in silence. The static that had once carried fear now murmured only with weather reports and the first hesitant signals of peace. Ships that had survived the long passage steamed homeward, antennas streaked with salt, their thin rods still trembling in the wind. The stupid tin can radar and its cousin, the HFDF broom, had done their part too thoroughly. Even their operators were unsure what to do with their quiet decks. In naval records, the outcome was clear enough. Approximately 780 U-boats destroyed, another 200 surrendered or scuttled, around 30,000 German submariners dead, roughly 36,000 Allied merchant sailors lost. The numbers vary among historians, but the imbalance remained. The hunters had vanished more completely than the hunted. For a chain of islands that had once stood on the brink of starvation, the sea lanes were open again, carrying not wheat and oil alone, but reassurance that industry coupled with intellect could alter destiny. Around the New World map of 1945, the technology's consequences rippled far beyond the reaches of sound. Microwave radar became a routine eye for civil aviation. Global navigation adopted high-frequency direction finding as a standard lifeline. What had been grotesque improvisations, broomsticks and tin cans, evolved into the foundations of post-war electronics, linking continents rather than convoys. To engineers, the Battle of the Atlantic offered the first proof that distributed sensing and coordination could outweigh sheer firepower. To soldiers, it illustrated that technology is never neutral. It becomes humane or monstrous only through intention and restraint. Margaret V. Allen returned to Glasgow University before the end of 1946, her hands scarred from years of solder and rain. Her students remembered her understated humour. If a bit of wire hums, listen before you mend it. Privately, she carried quieter lessons. In an unpublished note found among her papers, paraphrased here, she wrote, "We heard victory through borrowed tools, but we also heard the cost, the pause between clicks, the breath before silence." This equilibrium between triumph and grief defined her generation's relationship with progress. They had proved that knowledge could shield, yet understood that the act of listening itself imposes moral debt. Every discovery bears witness to destruction it may prevent or repeat. In later military studies, strategists identified three intertwined lessons. First, the campaign confirmed that information dominance could disarm even the mightiest mechanical force. Second, it demonstrated the necessity of cooperation across disciplines and nations. The Atlantic victory had been as much an alliance of minds as of navies. And third, less often admitted, it exposed how dependence on intelligence breeds its own blindness. The faith that knowing equates to control. That faith would resurface in later conflicts, Korea, the Cold War and beyond, whenever radar screens or satellites promised safety through surveillance. Ethically, the transformation carried weight heavier than tonnage. The sea, once symbolic of isolation, had turned into a listening medium, binding enemy and ally alike. For every broadcast constrained by radio discipline, there had been some operator straining to interpret heartbeat-like pulses across an indifferent element. Historians still debate whether such constant awareness dulled empathy or deepened it. Some veterans said they came to feel kinship with unseen adversaries, others confessed numbness after years of abstract contacts reduced to dots on scopes. In either case, the war's most decisive arena became one of intimate detachment, a paradox that continues to echo wherever remote sensing defines combat. Politically, the legacy was twofold. Britain retained its passage to the wider world, allowing the flow of aid and reconstruction material that underpinned recovery in Europe. The United States emerged with industrial momentum headed toward global dominance in electronics and communications. Germany, devastated and divided, retained in its engineers the same technical brilliance redirected into civilian industries during the following decades. The quiet revolution of microwaves that followed owed as much to this shared pool of scientific survival as to battlefield victory. What radar, direction finding, and code breaking had built under coercion would become essential to peacetime: commercial radio, meteorology, navigation, and eventually digital computation. Yet among those who had once depended on a flickering needle to distinguish life from loss, the peace was anything but silent. Allied destroyers transformed into training vessels, their antennas dismantled or stored in depots. Maritime museums displayed fragments labelled with official pride. But the sailors' folklore outlasted the exhibits. A paraphrased entry from Seaman Tom Hart of HMS Godicha, written in 1946, captured the mood. Sometimes the radio hisses for no reason, and we half expect the old broom to twitch again. Maybe the sea likes to remind us who listened first. It was an innocent superstition, yet a poetic acknowledgement that the ocean had become inexorably intertwined with the human ear. From a historian's standpoint, the line between verified fact and interpretation remains delicate. We can measure tonnage saved, frequencies used, and hours flown, but we cannot calibrate hope restored in a darkened ship's mess hall. The factual core endures. A crude metal array, dismissed as absurd, narrowed a war once thought lost. The interpretive layer is subtler, that progress often wears the face of modesty, and that ridicule is sometimes the beginning of insight. Allen's broom, the technician's tin cans, the tired operators scribbling bearings on damp logbooks all testify that innovation is rarely heroic in conception, it is persistence at the edge of failure. Seen from our present century, where satellites chart every storm and fiber optics bind the continents they once saved, the Atlantic campaign reveals a lineage. The same frequencies that hunted submarines now guide aircraft, forecast hurricanes, and connect homes to unseen clouds of information. Each convenience carries the echo of its wartime birth. Knowing this does not romanticize conflict, it cautions against forgetting the origins of what we call connectivity. The airwaves that comfort us today were cleansed at bitter cost. In one of her last lectures in 1960, Margaret Allen concluded with words that her students later remembered as both technical and elegiac. When you tune a receiver, you don't create the signal, you choose to hear it. Science is that choice, repeated endlessly. It was a quiet summation of a life spent between static and meaning. Her remark survives as perhaps the truest moral of the tin can radar. Invention is not an act of conjuring, but of attentive empathy. Listening remains the beginning of both defense and understanding. And so, when the wind moves over memorial harbors and sea buoys pulse their coded beacons, one can imagine those humble antennas still alive in metal successors, no longer broomsticks but satellite dishes, still turning to catch invisible whispers across enormous distances. They remind us that every signal, however faint, carries the memory of its first purpose, to protect fragile lives amid overpowering noise. The ocean remains vast, the static eternal. What changes is whether we still have the moral patience to listen.